Hey guys, we'll give people a couple more minutes before I start here because it's like 12:27. So um, we'll start here in a few minutes. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll see if other people show as we get going here. So in class today, we have two chapters to get through, just chapter 6 and 8. And then, of course, next week we would have our test. So I did forward you guys, some tips, to help you focus on what to look at for the, the first test. So hopefully you guys have started to get into that a little bit. Don't forget to include your ATI book in your studying, because your ATI book sometimes is a little bit better at focusing, what you're trying to talk about compared to your actual big book. So make sure you're looking at that. Okay, so with chapter 6, this just gets into a little bit of ethics in the community. Some of the things we're going to talk about would be a little bit of a history of ethics in nursing practice. We talk about the ethical decision-making process, which we've talked about before in other classes. We're going to compare and contrast ethical theories and principles, virtue of ethics, caring and the ethic of the care, and feminist ethics. Comprehend the ethics inherent in the core functions of public health nursing. We're going to look at the code of ethics for nursing and for public health, and then apply the ethics of advocacy to the nursing practice. Okay, so when we get into history, of course, one of the first people that comes to mind is Florence Nightingale. So she had a distinct vision for how she thought nursing should be. She thought that anyone who went into nursing should have like a call to service, like you should feel it's your calling to be a nurse. Anyone who was a nurse should have high moral character, and they should have a commitment to the poor, to help the poor. So, they obviously can't help themselves, so someone needs to help them. So she thought nursing is the people to do it. This mentions the Nightingale Pledge. When we actually have graduation and we do pinning ceremony, we actually do the Nightingale Pledge at the pinning ceremony. So this was technically one of the first code of ethics. The stuff that is said in that is kind of all about ethics. And then back in the 1950s, there was an actual code of ethics for nurses that was written with interpretive statements. This was done by the American Nurses Association, and they passed it through their House of Delegates. So it was voted on. And then in 1953, the first International Code of Ethics was developed. This was developed by the International Council of Nurses. And then in the 1960s, bioethics kind of, came into play. And then in 2002, the Public Health Code of Ethics. So this was adopted, and it presents principles, rules, and ideas to guide public health practice, but it's not intended to provide a specific action plan for ethical decision making. All right, so then when we do talk about ethical decision making, remember, there's going to be times in your career where you'll come across a situation that is just going to be one of those things that you just don't know what the right thing to do is. So you need to kind of go through that ethical decision-making process to figure out what to do. And you have to take in other people's thoughts and wishes into accountability as well as your own. So with this, it's just saying that you have to identify and justify moral norms. You need to think independently, what is your moral responsibility in the situation? So you're kind of thinking about that. And then you also have to think about the growing multiculturalism. Because we have so many people of other cultures in our country now that we end up taking care of, there's a number of different beliefs out there, and you may come up with some kind of ethical dilemma that you're going to have to deal with. So ethical issues are moral challenges facing nurses of the nursing profession. In nursing, one such challenge is how to prepare an adequate and competent workforce for the future. In contrast with ethical dilemmas are human dilemmas. And puzzling moral problems in which a person, group, or community can envision morally justified reasons for both taking or not taking a certain course of action. One example of an ethical dilemma is how to allocate resources in two equally needy populations when the resources are sufficient to serve only one of the populations. So if you can imagine, like if you're part of the government and you have to decide, like you're doing your budget for the year or whatever, and you have to decide between two needy populations who gets the bulk of the money, that would be really hard to do, to try and figure out who to give it to. So this should look kind of familiar. This is that ethical decision-making framework that we've talked about before. So basically you just identify what the ethical issue or dilemma is. You find meaningful context to look at it, through, obtain all the facts, get all the facts regarding the situation, reformulate if needed, consider appropriate actions or options, and decide what you're going to do, and then evaluate the decision and action. So two factors that affect ethical decision making would be, again, the growing multiculturalism that we have in our country right now. And then also moral distress would be the other thing. Okay, so when you're looking at an ethical situation, 4 situations that you can judge would be like this. So someone is at direct risk of harm. Sure, you could judge if that was the case. Ethnic cultural standards conflict with professional standards. So maybe someone's ethnic preferences conflict with what the professional standard really is. So you would have to decide, what to do from there. Or the greater community's values are jeopardized. Or the ethnic community customs are annoying but not problematic for the greater community. So sometimes you might not totally like or agree with someone else's things that they do. They might annoy you, but it's still maybe important for them to do as long as it doesn't affect anyone else in a poor way. All right, so when we talk about moral distress, there's some things that we need to think about. First of all, we need to identify situations that could lead to this. We need to communicate our concerns and examine ways to address the stress, and then seek support from our colleagues. It's really useful to talk to your colleagues about stuff that's bothering you, because sometimes they'll give you an opinion or say something that'll resonate with you more so than your own thoughts. Like maybe you can't just quite figure it out on your own, but talking it through with someone will help you figure it out. And so, by talking with someone, you may learn that they have similar concerns or that they have found ways to interrupt the stressful situation. So it might help you be able to deal with it better. All right, so again, this just gets into a little bit about ethics in general, like, all these different definitions that we'll get into on the very next slide I'll talk about. And then, why do we have ethics? What's the purpose of having them?
To provide like competent care.
Yeah, we have to have some kind of standard to live by. So, we can't just go willy-nilly into a patient situation and not know like there's a standard to perform by, So they do have a good purpose, right? So on this next slide, there's 3 million different things that we're going to talk about here. So I'm going to give you some definitions that you can kind of, go along with some of these things. And some of them you may already know, some of them you may not. So again, with ethics, it's going to be something that helps us decide the type of person we're going to be. So it addresses questions like, how should I behave? What action should I perform? What kind of person should I be? What are my obligations to myself and also to my fellow humans? And then, ethical judgments are concerned with values. So the goal of an ethical judgment is to choose the action or state of affairs that is good or right in those circumstances. So then this mentions something called consequentialism. So just like it sounds, consequences, we always have consequences for our actions. So when you talk about consequentialism, this is a decision based on outcomes or consequences. So the right action is the one that produces the greatest amount of good or the least amount of harm in a given situation. So, it kind of makes sense. That sounds good to me, that, I want to do the most good and the least amount of harm in a situation. I don't know if you know this next one or not, but utilitarianism. So this is a well-known consequentialist theory. So it's a type of theory that kind of, is under consequentialism. So it appeals exclusively to outcomes or consequences in determining which choice to make. And then the one underneath that, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, denatology, maybe? Denatology? So this may conclude that an action is right or wrong in itself, regardless of the amount of good that might come from it. So in other words, if something was going to cause a lot of good, you may still think that it's the wrong action with this. All right, and then a couple of these next ones should sound pretty familiar because we've talked about them before in other classes. So respect for autonomy. So this means that an individual should be permitted to choose their actions and goals that fulfill their life plan unless those choices result in harm to other people. So they should be able to make their own decisions. Then this gets into non-malfeasance. So remember, this is the do no harm. So we have to act in the standards of due care. We need to seek to produce the least amount of harm in what we do when we're caring for patients. What does it mean to act in the standards of due care? What does that mean?
Um, like to follow guidelines and like what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So as a nurse, if you're expected to, I don't know, like say someone falls on your unit and, during this whole episode, what are you expected to do? What would a nurse who is doing due process do in that situation? That's kind of what this is getting at. So sure, I would check on the patient and make sure the patient is okay first. I would get a set of vitals. I would, make sure nothing is broke, like look through everything, make sure they're okay. I would call someone and make sure they come to take a look at them, right? Because typically someone who falls has to get looked at by a physician. And then, of course, you would fill out what am I trying to say? The fall report, or the incident report, whatever you want to call it. So you have to fill out all the details of that whole situation. So if you didn't do those things and like say you just walked past the room, even though you saw them on the floor and just left them there, then someone could say that you caused harm, that you didn't do what a normal nurse would do in that situation. And then maybe they would try and, throw you a lawsuit or something, right? So now non-malfeasance is doing no harm. So beneficence is another one of those things that we've talked about before. So this is doing good. So it's the opposite of non-malfeasance. So we have the general obligation to perform actions to maintain or enhance dignity of other people. And when those actions do not place undue health burden on healthcare providers. So it's basically just the opposite of non-malfeasance. All right, the next one here is one that I don't know if you've heard of before. This is distributive justice. So what this is, they say there must be a fair distribution of benefits and burdens in society based on the needs and contributions of all of its members. So again, I'll just repeat it real quick in case you're trying to write this down. So the idea behind distributive justice is there must be a fair distribution of benefits and burdens in society based on the needs and contributions of its members. And that society must determine a minimal level of goods and services available to its members. Okay, the very next one, egalitarianism. So this one means that everyone's entitled to equal rights and equal treatment in society. So I think we probably pretty much all believe that way for the most part. Then there is libertarianism. This is the right to private property is the most important right. That's what people who believe like that are. They just value private property more than anything else. And then I'm just going to give you one more definition. The very bottom one, the communitarianism. This one means individual rights must be balanced with social responsibilities. Individuals do not live in isolation, but are shaped by values and culture of their communities. So one more time. Individual rights must be balanced with social responsibilities. Individuals do not live in isolation, but are shaped by their values and culture of their communities. All right, so this talks about virtues. Virtues are acquired. So it's excellent traits of character that dispose humans to act in accord with their natural good. So on this slide, it talks about, hey, what kind of person should I be? So our virtues kind of, contribute to that. Our goal is to enable people to flourish as human beings. Aristotle said, acting in accordance with our natural good, just like he said. And this is central to professional ethics in public health nursing. So caring in nursing, the ethic of care, and feminist ethics are all kind of related to each other. So caring is in the nursing role as a response to desire to differentiate nursing practice from medical practice. If you think about it, if you think about physicians, and I'm not saying every physician is like this, there's a lot of good ones out there, but if you would compare what a nurse does compared to what a physician does when they go in and see a patient, like how much time they spend with them and how much of a rapport they have together, typically the nurse has the better rapport and they spend more time with them and care more about what's going on with that patient compared to the physician. So it kind of differentiates us a little bit from, the medical practice. And then, Erickson, going back to talking about some of those theories, with Erickson, he talked about caring a little bit with his theories. There is definitely a relationship between caring and ethics or morality. Okay, when you talk about feminists, these can be women or men. Typically, I think we think they're all women usually, but they can be women and men. So they hold this view that they should advocate for economic, social, and political rights for women that are equivalent to those of men. And they reject the devaluing of women. When you talk about feminist ethics, this is women's thinking and moral experiences are important and should be taken into account in any fully developed moral theory. And they say the oppression of women is morally wrong. So one of the things I just remember seeing recently in the news that kind of makes me think about feminist ethics is the U.S. women's soccer team. They have been in court trying to fight for equal pay, compared to what the men's U.S. soccer team gets paid. So they're still fighting that out because they're trying to get equal rights compared to what the men have. Okay, so part of our ethics and core functions of population-centered nursing. So there's a few different things that we do according to this. So we not only would assess a community, because we're talking about community nursing here, that would be part of our what we do, but we also help develop policies to help, assist the community for the good of more than just one person. And then we also use assurance. So we're going to talk about each one of those things now. So there's 3 ethical tenets of assessment. So competency. So you want to know that the nurse that's assessing you is competent, right? So if I'm a community health nurse, I need to know that this person is competent in community assessment. They need to have enough knowledge about that. They need to be able to, look at data and make, good decisions because they have that knowledge. So are the persons assigned to develop community knowledge adequately prepared to collect data on groups and populations? So for instance, maybe I work at a public health department and maybe there's been budget cuts and so some people have left and I need to hire someone else. Well, maybe the pool of people that I have that are applying for this job aren't really that educated in public health. Maybe they totally have never worked in it before. So you have to then decide, okay, should I work short and not hire someone new because this person doesn't have good enough experience and they're not that competent? Or should I hire this new person even though they don't have all of this background, because I know I'm going to have to watch them closer and do more with them for them to be able to help me in the long run. So that's kind of part of this. Virtue ethics or moral character. So this person would have to have that too. And then the do no harm is also part of this. So in the assessment, they need to have that as part of what they do in their assessment. They don't want to harm anyone. They want to do good for everyone. With policy development, there's 3 ethical things that we think about with policy development. We want to achieve the public good. So this is rooted in citizenship. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're just thinking about one person now. We're thinking about whole communities. Service to others over themselves. So a lot of times you'll meet people who are very much like this. They think of other people more than they think of themselves. And that's kind of what we're going for here. So you serve rather than steer. You serve the citizens, not customers. Value citizenship and public service above entrepreneurship. And then what is ethical is also good policy. So we want to achieve the public good here. So this approach is basically one in which the voice of the community is the foundation upon which policy is developed, rather than the voice of the community and public health administrators. So you want to know what are the community needs and how can I make that better as someone who works in public health. All right, and then this talks about assurance. So there's 2 ethical tenets of assurance, and they are all persons should receive essential personal health services, and then providers of public health services are competent and available. So, the public should have these basic assurances, when you go to get treatment. So there are a lot of debates out there on whether you think someone should be ethically, if you think someone should be able to receive treatment if they constantly don't do what they're supposed to do. So if you go and look at other countries, there's some countries where health is more of a privilege. You go to the doctor, and if your doctor tells you, hey, you need to eat better or you need to lose weight, this person does that. They don't let it go in one ear and out the other. They actually physically try to do that. And so they earn the right to have, health care. Whereas in our country, we can have people who you can tell till you're blue in the face something, and they'll still keep doing the wrong thing. They'll still keep smoking and doing all these things they're not supposed to do. And yet we still take care of them. We think everyone is on the same page with having health as an underlying right or responsibility. What do you guys think about that? Do you think the United States is doing that correctly, or do you think we should take a page out of one of the other countries' books?
I personally think it's hit or miss. Canada is different than us, but we do some things right. They do some things right. It's a mixture that we need to have happen.
Yeah, sometimes I think that maybe there is a little bit of something to that maybe if we scared people a little bit more, then maybe they would do more of the right thing with their health. Maybe we wouldn't have so many, chronic conditions that we have to deal with, so, because people would be doing more of the right thing. So it's kind of an ethical dilemma in some sense. Okay, then this gets into a little bit about the Nursing Code of Ethics, which I don't know if you guys have ever looked at that before. So the Code of Ethics, it has basically 9 provisional statements in this code. So the first 3 focus on the recipients of nursing care. And then the next few, 4 through 6, focus on the nurse themselves. So this focus addresses nurses' accountability, their competency, and it contributes to their employment conditions as well. And then the last few, 7 through 9, They focus on the bigger picture of both the nursing profession and national and global health concerns. So it's regarding the nursing profession. The emphasis on professional standards, active involvement in nursing, and integrity of the profession. So if you ever kind of have a question about what you should do ethically with something, if you ever just look at the Code of Ethics for Nurses, and it's located on the American Nurses Association website. You could find it there easily. This kind of addresses pretty much everything you need to know. All right, there also is a public health code of ethics. This asserts the collective and societal nature of public health to keep people healthy. So there's 12 principles related to the ethical practice of public health. And they have 11 values and beliefs that focus on health, community, and action. So they talk about advocacy and ethics. So again, we have codes and standards of practice that we have to follow. Why is it important to be advocates to people in the community, you guys?
Sometimes they might not speak up for themselves, or they might not know any different. And so it's really for the patient's benefit and safety reasons.
Yeah, definitely. Well said, Erica. Okay, so the American Public Health Association represents a powerful voice in public health advocacy. They focus on finding ways to involve healthcare professionals in influencing policies related to protection of all Americans and their communities from preventable, serious health threats, and helping to ensure access to health care and also eliminating health disparities. All right, and then like we said, there's all these different standards of practice that we have to live by. So again, the Code of Ethics for Nurses you could find on the ANA website. And this was, updated back in 2001. There is also that Public Health Code of Ethics that we just talked about that came about in 2002. Public health nursing has a scope and standard of practice that the ANA devised back in 2007. And then there's also skills for the ethical practice of Public Health Leadership Society that came out with some standards as well in 2004. Okay, so we have a conceptual framework for advocacy. So this means this contrasts social justice and market justice. So we need to know what each of those things are. So the biggest barrier to achieving social justice is the competing concept of market justice. A focus on market justice rather than social justice influences public dialogue about public health needs. So basically what market justice is, it's grounded in the assumption that the best way to meet the needs of individuals in a society is to avoid regulations. So the focus is more on the individual and not shared needs. So, when you're talking about communities then, really you're looking at the greater good in a community. You're looking at groups of people, not just individuals. So, yeah, so that's kind of what this is getting at. All right, so what school of thought has the greatest influence on current debates about public health? Our answer is C, market justice. And then this is just reiterating what we just said, so I'm not going to repeat that. Okay. So this talks about a practical framework for advocacy. So this person named Bateman's ethical principles for the advocate's core skills. So this means that people should have these skills when they think about advocating for others. So we want to act in the patient's best interests. We want to act in accordance with the patient's wishes. We want to keep the patient properly informed, respond with diligence and competence, act impartially, and offer frank, independent advice, and then maintain patient confidentiality. That's super important. So advocates' core skills include interviewing, assertiveness and force, negotiation, self-management, legal knowledge, and research and litigation. The patient may be a person, a group, or a community. And then this gets into a little bit about advocacy and bioterrorism. It's kind of sad that in this day and age we have to worry about bioterrorism, but it didn't used to be a thing, and now we have to think about that. They said, after the 9/11 attacks brought a frightening new awareness of the vulnerability of individuals and groups in our society, and the need for advocacy. So they're saying, thoughtfully reflect on and debate ethical issues that arise with the threat, action, and aftermath of terrorism. Consider your own responsibilities in terms of moral obligation to respond, and make yourself available in a crisis that threatens the well-being of a community. So if you want to be an advocate and fight things like bioterrorism, then you would be part of that response team. If there's something that happens in a community, you would be one of those first people who would go up and volunteer to help. Okay, so nurses can be an important voice in advocating for access to consistent, effective, and efficient healthcare for all our society. In 2010, a healthcare bill provides an opportunity for nurses to advocate for healthcare for all, to ethics and social justice. And then this gets into a teeny bit about the ethical use of social media. So we want to promote client dignity, seek their best interest, avoid inappropriate involvement, and refrain from personal gain at the client's expense. So believe it or not, we had a student not that long ago at Herzing who totally did not follow this ethical use of social media. So he was at clinical and used his cell phone to take pictures, and he posted them immediately onto Facebook, and it was just bad. So with this, I always tell people, you always have to think your actions have consequences no matter what you do. And especially with social media, like, I don't know if you guys have heard about this a lot, but there's a lot of employers that look at social media. So like if they're looking at you to hire you, they might look at your social media account and see what kinds of things you're saying. So I'm sure you've all seen someone do this before, where maybe they said something nasty about their employer or something like that on social media. That people can fire you for that. They can look at that. So like going back to this student, of course he got reprimanded for doing that. And honestly, I don't think he even thought about what could have happened here. But like, we could have gotten kicked out of our clinical site because of this. Someone could easily have seen something that he posted and been like, oh, that's my dad or whatever in the picture, and I don't know what the heck he posted as far as what was in the picture, but it wasn't good. And he continued to do it. So now he's not at Herzing anymore. So just be aware that your actions definitely have consequences with social media, and we have to be very careful with how we use that. Have you guys ever seen anyone have anything like that happen with like a job situation or anything? No?
Getting PPE for like the corona stuff. One of the aides kept trying to get people to take his picture in the PPE.
Oh, yeah. You got to be careful with some of that. some of it seems pretty harmless, you know, like maybe you're in an area where you don't have any patients involved or something like that. Maybe that might be okay, but you have to be super careful with stuff that you post, because, you know, it can come back and bite you in the butt easily. Okay, so we got one more thing to go through. This would be Chapter 8. This is public health policy. Okay, so in here, we are talking about the U.S. government and healthcare roles. We're identifying the functions of the key governmental and quasi-governmental agencies that affect public health systems and nursing. We're differentiating between primary bodies of law that affect nursing and healthcare. And we're defining some key terms related to policy and politics. We're stating relationships among nursing practice, health policy, and politics. And then we're developing and implementing a plan to communicate with policymakers on a chosen public health issue. Okay. So this says, can you predict the meanings of? So when we say policy, we are talking about a settled course of action to be followed by a government or institution to obtain a desired end. So for example, you know, a business might have a policy on social media, like we were just talking about. So they may actually come out with like a written whatever to say, hey, this is our policy on it. And if you don't follow this, this is the consequences that could happen. So it's a course of action to be followed by, you know, in that case, a business to obtain a desired end. And then public policy. So this is described as all governmental activities, direct or indirect, that influence the lives of all citizens. So for example, a public policy right now would be, you know, these things put in place by the Ohio government about our stay-at-home orders and stuff, you know, for this coronavirus, which I know a lot of that's being lifted now, but yeah, so some of those that was put into place to influence the lives of the citizens here in Ohio, so we could, you know, prevent further death and destruction from this coronavirus, right? And then health policy. So this is a set course of action to obtain a desired outcome for an individual, family, group, community, or society. So let me give you an example here. Like really, you could use the corona, you know, stuff for this as well. But like say we had a person who has some kind of contagious disease, like maybe they have TB. So you discharge them from the hospital and you tell them that they have to stay isolated for a certain amount of time, right? So that's a health policy because we're putting forth a course of action to try to keep that person safe and other people in the community safe as well. So yeah, so typically like some type of problem like that has to be reported to the public health department. They have to be made aware of stuff like that so that they can track these people and make sure, you know, things aren't getting worse. Okay, politics. So this is the art of influencing others to accept a specific course of action. So yeah, I'm sure we all see all the craziness, you know, from the different politicians all the time on the news and things that they do. And then with law, this is a system of privileges and processes by which people solve problems based on a set of established rules. It's intended to minimize the use of force. So if you have, you know, rules about something, a law, If you put that in place, as long as that law is in place, hopefully you don't have to enforce it with, the use of force, because that law is already in place and people know that they should or shouldn't do that. Okay, and then this is just reiterating everything again. Okay, so then this talks about the government's role in U.S. healthcare. So, of course, the executive branch is going to involve your president, the cabinet, the various administrative and regulatory departments and agencies, like the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So, what the executive branch does is they suggest, administer, and regulate policy. The legislative branch, it would be your Senate and your House of Representatives, right? So these guys identify problems and they propose, debate, pass, and modify laws to address those problems. So like say, there was a gun issue, that's like a hot topic in Congress right now. So with all of the different people getting shot up all the time in these different gun incidences in the United States, there's always debates on the Congress floor about that, on what we should do to fix that. So sometimes people try and pass different laws regarding that. Then the judicial branch. This is a system of federal, state, and local courts that are guided by opinions of the Supreme Court. So they will interpret laws and their meaning. And there's a specific thing that they mention here on the slide, the Stewart Machine Company versus Davis. So this must have been a certain court case. So this was the first case to challenge federally created health programs. So the Supreme Court determined that federal government action was within the powers of Congress to promote general welfare. And then they talk about something called police power. So an example of this is requiring immunizations of children for entry into school. So this power allows the states to protect the health and safety and welfare of their citizens. Such police power must be used fairly, and the state must show that it has a compelling interest in taking actions, especially actions that might infringe on individual rights. Okay, so which group proposes, debates, passes, and modifies laws to address problems? This is going to be our legislative branch. Okay, so the legislative branch of the U.S. government does all of that. They propose, debate, pass, and modifies laws. And remember, the executive branch is going to suggest, administer, and regulate policy. And then the judicial branch is a system of federal, state, and local courts guided by opinions of the Supreme Court. Okay, so this slide talks about some key historical events in public health that kind of shifted governmental roles. The process of shifting responsibility for planning, delivery, and financing programs from the federal level to the states is called devolution. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Congress increasingly funded health programs by giving back grants to the states. So here's some key historical events related to that. So 1798, creation of Public Health Service. 1890, federal laws to promote the public health of merchant seamen and Native Americans. 1934, the first national health insurance bill was created. 1935, the Social Security Act was passed. 1948, National Institute of Health was created. 1953, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services was created. 1965, they created Medicare and Medicaid. And then in 2010, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was passed and signed by President Obama. So the government's role in healthcare has changed over time. So it's shaped by what our citizens' needs and demands are, what the citizens' beliefs and values are, and sometimes these beliefs and values clash with society's sense of responsibility and the need for equality for all citizens. And then this gives an example. In the 90s, they did this debate over healthcare reform, like whether that was needed or not. Okay, so this gets into public health law and bioterrorism preparedness. In 2000, the Public Health Threats and Emergencies Act was passed. This was the first federal law to address preparedness for bioterrorism and outbreaks. And then in 2002, the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act was passed, and it just made some improvements. So Public Health Safety and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act was created to implement the following anti-bioterrorism activities. So they wanted to improve public health capacity. They wanted to upgrade health professionals' ability to recognize and treat diseases caused by bioterrorism, because, you know, like I said, there was a time where we never saw it before. So, like, I don't know if you guys remember this, but do you remember when they were sending like packages to the White House with white powder in it and stuff like that? You know, people were worried about some of these bioterrorism things because we didn't know that much about that stuff. So if you get people to know more about those things, they can be better prepared. Speeding the development of new vaccines and other countermeasures. So like if there is a certain bioterrorism agent that some country might use against us, we need to have some way to fight that. So they're saying, you know, they're trying to speed up the process of getting these countermeasures available. They also wanted to improve water and food supply protection so that it wouldn't be easy for another terrorism event to happen to where they poison our water supply or they try to do something to our food supply. And then they also wanted to implement tracking and regulations to help with all of this as well. Okay, so with government healthcare functions, so direct services mean that federal, state, and local governments provide direct health services to certain individuals and groups. When we talk about financing, governments pay for some healthcare services and for some training of some health personnel and for biomedical and healthcare research. And then as far as information goes, all branches and levels of government collect, analyze, and disseminate data about healthcare and health status of citizens. For example, there's some type of annual report on the health of the people in the United States that comes out all of the time. And then with policy setting, so the chief government function, the governments at all levels and within all branches make policy decisions about health care. So it's not just like the federal government, it's, you know, at local levels as well. And then when this talks about public protection, the U.S. Constitution gives the federal government the authority to provide for the protection of the public's health. The function is carried out in numerous venues, such as by regulating air and water quality, and protecting the borders from the influx of diseases by controlling food, drugs, and animal transportation, just to name a few. Okay, so this also touches a little bit about Healthy People 2020. So I'm sure you guys have looked at that before. So, back in 2000, they came out with Healthy People, and it was a thing where they made these goals for the next so many years to try and improve the health and wellness of people in the country. And then every 10 years, they kind of update it and make it a little bit better. So, excuse me. The 4 overarching goals with this: we want people to be able to attain high quality, longer lives free of preventable disease, disability, injury, and premature death. We want to achieve health equality, eliminating disparities and improving health of all groups. We want to create social and physical environments that promote good health for all. And we want to promote quality of life, healthy development, and healthy behaviors across all life stages. All right, so there's multiple organizations and agencies that influence, the health of the country. So there's different international organizations, there's federal health agencies, federal non-health agencies, and also state and local health departments that, make a difference in the country's health. When we talk about international organizations, the United Nations, underneath them you have the World Health Organization. This is located in Washington, D.C. The Pan American Health Organization, which is part of, I think that's just another name for the World Health Organization. The World Health Assembly, this is a policy-making body. The World Health Report. The main purpose of this is to provide countries, donor agencies, international organizations, and others with information that they need to make policy and funding decisions. And so they say there's an increasing presence of nursing in international health arena, which is good. So besides offering direct healthcare services in every country in the world, nurses serve as consultants, as educators, and program planners and evaluators. Nurses focus their work on a variety of public health issues, including healthcare workforce and education, environment, sanitation, infectious diseases, wellness promotion, maternal and child health, and primary care. And then again, this just mentions some other federal health agencies that kind of help along with this. Here's some examples of non-health agencies. So we have the Department of Defense, the Department of Labor, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Justice that also influence healthcare. And then with state and local health departments. So with these, a lot of, I don't know if you've ever looked at a public health website or anything like in your local community, but like the one where I live in Portage County, and that health department isn't really that big, and they always are hiring. It seems like they never have enough people working there. So usually there's a shortage of public health workers. There's not a ton of people who go into that, but they have a big job. They work with other departments and they coordinate health efforts all over the county, So some of their programs will vary from, health department to health department. If you're in a bigger area, they might offer more. Like in my area with Portage, they don't do a whole lot. They might do immunization stuff there. They'll give you some basic, health information about like coronavirus or something on their website, but nothing, too crazy. Whereas if you went to the Akron, public health department, the Summit County one, it'd probably give you a lot more. Okay, the designation of money for specific needs or categorical funding has led to special and more narrowly focused nursing roles. For example, emergency preparedness and school nursing. The Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act was intended to improve the organization, direction, and utility of preparedness efforts. The number of types of laws influencing healthcare are ever increasing, so we'll see more and more of those. And then with constitutional law, this derives from federal and state constitutions. It provides overall guidance for selected practice situations. And then remember, we talked about police power a few minutes ago. So the state has police power to act through its public health system, but it also has limits. First, it must make a reasonable exercise of power. Second, if the power interferes or infringes on individual rights, the state must demonstrate that there is a compelling state interest in exercising this power. Isolating an individual or separating someone from a community because that person has a communicable disease has been deemed an appropriate exercise of state powers. So like a little bit ago when we were talking about the person who might have TB and isolating them from others. The state can isolate an individual even though it infringes on the individual rights, such as freedom and autonomy, in the following cases. So there has to be a compelling state interest in preventing an epidemic. The isolation is necessary to prevent the isolation, or excuse me, to protect the health and safety and welfare of individuals in the community or the public as a whole. And then the isolation is done in a reasonable manner. So it's not unreasonable the way that they did it. All right, when we talk about legislation, this is a law that comes from the legislative branch of the federal, state, or local government. It's referred to as a statute law because it becomes coded in the statutes of a government. And when we talk about regulations, these are specific statements of law related to or defining or implanting individual pieces of legislation or statutes. For example, state legislators enact laws or statutes establishing boards of nursing and defining terms such as a registered nurse or, a licensed practical nurse. Every state has a board of nursing. The board may be found either in the Department of Licensing Boards of the Health Department or in an administrative agency of the governor's office. So regulations are created by legislation known as a State Nurse Practice Act. The Board of Nursing is made up of nurses and also consumers, which I don't know if you guys have ever looked at that or if you've ever wondered who was on that board. They elect people every so many years to that. And, typically there's multiple nurses on it from different parts of the state, but there's also consumers that get to be put on that to have a voice in what happens with, nurses in Ohio. Okay, with judicial law, this is based on court or jury decisions. And then case law is opinions of the courts. When you talk about a precedent, this is one principle of common law. It means that judges are bound by previous decisions unless they are convinced that the older law is no longer relevant or valid. And then the last four things on this slide that talks about justice, fairness, respective autonomy, and self-determination. These are other principles of common law. They're part of the court's rationale and the basis on which to make a decision. All right, and then when we talk about scope of practice, this involves defining nursing, setting its credentials, and then distinguishing it between the practice of different types of nurses, physicians, and other healthcare providers. Of course, we all have to be licensed to be a practicing nurse, so we have to have licensure. So it's especially important to nurses in community settings who often practice with much autonomy. So then this mentions a little bit about malpractice and professional negligence. So remember, this is an act or a failure to act that leads to injury of the patient. So going back to my one example that I said earlier, if you walked past a patient's room and you saw them on the floor and you didn't go in there to try and help them, and later, you found out that they died or something, you would be held accountable for that. So anyway, to recover money, damages, and malpractice action, the patient must prove the following things. So they have to prove that the nurse owed a duty to the patient or was responsible for that person's care. That duty to act that a way a reasonable, prudent nurse would act in the same circumstances was not fulfilled. So like in my example, a normal nurse that saw someone on the floor would go in and see if this patient was okay. So in that instance, that person didn't fulfill their duty. And then other two things they have to prove is that the failure to act reasonably under the circumstances led to injuries. So in that case, because that person was injured and then later died, that is definitely a big problem. And then the fourth thing is that the injuries provided the basis for a monetary claim from the nurse as compensation for the injury. That's kind of what they look at if you're getting sued for malpractice. Okay, so there's specific legal issues of nursing that vary depending on the setting where the care is delivered, the clinical arena, and the nurse's functional role. Like you can imagine, some of the different things that you might come across, like say you're a school nurse and you deal with, I don't know, maybe you deal with people who have asthma a lot. There's a lot of kids with asthma in your school. And maybe they have to come down and take their inhaler in the nurse's office all the time. So maybe someone has an asthma attack at school and that, I don't know, maybe they have a bad outcome or something. So a legal issue that you could face is that you didn't act accordingly, or maybe they had an asthma action plan and you didn't follow that or something. So that could be a legal issue that you might face. If you're an occupational health nurse, this means that you work, in some business somewhere. Like say, I'm trying to think of the name of that company down in Canton. Shoot, I can't think of it at the moment. There's a huge company down in the Canton area that Timken. That's what I'm trying to think of. So like say you work at Timken and you're the occupational health nurse for the people who work there. So typically you have to keep track of, maybe different occupational exposures that they might have there. Like there's all these different OSHA regulations that you have to follow. And so if someone gets exposed to something inadvertently or something, you could be involved in that because you were the occupational health nurse. With home care and hospice, that can get kind of sticky at times. Maybe there's certain wishes that the patient wanted, and maybe you have it documented in like a durable power of attorney or something, but then family doesn't agree. And so there can be legal issues that way. Or correctional health, there's all kinds of crazy things that can happen if you're a nurse that works at a jail. There's, fights that can happen. There's sexual assaults. There's all kinds of crazy things. So you could be involved in something along those lines. So it's just going to kind of vary depending on where you work and what setting you work in. Okay, with school health legislation establishes a minimum of services that must be provided to children in public and private schools. So for example, it's required that immunizations, be on file for every kid, that you have it documented that everyone's had their appropriate immunizations to attend school. They also have to have periodic physical exams, or they do vision and scoliosis screenings in school too when you're younger. That's, something that is established they have to do. There's also different statutes addressing child abuse and neglect. What is our thing in Ohio about child abuse? What is our responsibility if we see a child that we think was abused?
We have to report it right away.
Yeah, who do we report it to?
Social services or child protection services. Yeah.
Yeah, and then who would it be if we were talking about older adults?
I don't know.
Adult Protective Services. Okay. And then what would make you suspect that a child was being abused? What kinds of things might you see?
Bruises, maybe being a little skittish of you. You really watch how they play with their like dolls and stuff too, because that can be a telltale sign also.
Okay. And then maybe they're missing a lot of school, that could be kind of a red flag as well, because they're injured or something happened. Okay, with occupational health nursing, there are state workers' compensation statutes. There's a lot of, I don't know if you guys know anyone that's ever had to do workers' compensation for something. There's a lot of different regulations that you have to follow about that. So you have to keep really good records of everything. And every time they go to the doctor, you have to have a record of everything. You have to keep everything confidential. And then there's use of standing orders with this as well. And then with home care and hospice, there are state statutes, there are licensure and certification things that you have to have in place. And again, elder abuse statutes that we were just talking about. So again, if you suspect abuse with an elder, you would call Adult Protective Services. And there's not, and again, we need to stress this with both children and adults. If you suspected abuse, it's not necessarily just physical abuse. It could be other types of abuse too. So with adults, what other types of things would we might maybe see?
Financial or emotional, verbal.
Yeah. What's an example of how someone could abuse someone financially?
If their son or daughter or something using it to actually pay their bills, but they're telling the elder person that they are.
Okay, that's a good one. And you're right about the emotional abuse too. That's a big one. How can you tell if someone's being emotionally abused?
Like they have low self-esteem.
Okay.
They might think that everything is their fault.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then, of course, sexual abuse is another concern here too for elders and for kids. So that would also be something we'd have to watch out for. And then on this slide, it also talks about other pertinent issues that you might see happening with home care and hospice. So like the whole death with dignity. So sometimes we have a certain view of how we think people should pass away or different ways that people should be cared for. Like, for instance, I have a neighbor next door who her mom just died. And I don't know, her mom was in her 90s, so she had a long life. But she had dementia really bad. And they kept her in her own home this whole time. And they just had people, coming in to take care of her. And she said that she was probably dying for a good 10 days, and they did not have her well, I forget how she put it exactly. It wasn't that she was in a ton of pain, but she was like super restless and unsettled, like. And so she said for the majority of those 10 days, she was like that. And it wasn't until maybe 2 days before she died that she actually seemed comfortable. So they were kind of upset about that. So there's always, different expectations that people have. So if you were in home care or hospice working as a nurse, it's always good to have really good communication with the family. And so, like in this situation, maybe they needed to be talked to a little bit more about some of the things that you might see, that were, um, things that are common in people who are dying, especially with someone with dementia. Other things here, this talks about the rights of long-term care and home health patients, defining of death. That's kind of a sticky situation sometimes. So some people, hey, are they brain dead, or do you just not feel a heartbeat anymore? What's the definition of death, And then use of living wills and advance directives. That's always, a possible sticky situation. With correctional health, there's laws that relate to the following: the type and number of services that must be provided, the basic level of care that should be provided, and then the access to care during illness. What do you guys think about that? If someone's in jail, what's your opinion? What kind of rights do you think they should have regarding their health?
I feel like they should have pretty much the same access to healthcare that they otherwise would be getting.
So I know this may sound stupid, but I was watching this movie over the weekend, and it was on what's his name? It was like a mobster guy back from the 20s, and he, I guess, he was only 48 when he died. I can't believe this, but anyway, in this movie, it was depicting like his last few years of life, and he should have really been in jail still, but they actually released him early because he was so sickly and messed up. And so they let him go home, and he lived out the rest of his life at home, and he just had a messed up life. But he died at 48. And I just thought to myself, why does he get the right to go home and live, out the remaining days at home, whereas there's probably 3 million other people in the court system who they would never let do that? It was just kind of crazy. Okay, this also talks about the nurse's role in policy. So hopefully you guys feel this a little bit more as you get more into nursing and you're practicing for a few years. I hope you feel like you do have a voice in how things go in nursing. If you don't like how something is, then you need to talk to someone about that and have a voice about it, because if you don't, who's going to do it, So with legislative action and all of this, it doesn't mean that we all have to go down to Columbus and like march on the Capitol building and say, different things about different things. We don't all have to do that, but you do have a voice, and you can write letters to your congressman in your area to tell them, hey, I don't like the staffing that is going on right now. I think it should be this, and give them opinions about it. Give them examples of things that you see, because believe it or not, congressmen do like to hear from people who are actually nurses, who what they're talking about with this. It helps them influence them sometimes with their decisions. So hopefully you guys, feel the need to do that in the future, because we really do all need to have a voice about that. This talks about nurses can be involved in the legislative process at any point. You could do a face-to-face encounter with your congressman, like make an appointment and go actually talk to him face-to-face. You could do a personal letter, like I was saying. You could do an email, a phone call. You could even testify in court sometimes with different things. You could do a petition. There's different position papers on things, speeches that people do. You can participate in demonstrations. There's all these different ways to help influence health policy. Okay, and then this talks about regulatory action. So the regulatory process, although it may not be visible process as legislation, can also be used to shape laws and dramatically affect health policy. All right, so the process of regulation, you have advisory groups and special task forces that people are on to kind of help, shape the policies in healthcare. So nurses' means of influence, like I said, writing letters, speaking at public hearings, attending hearings, testifying, and lobbying. Those are all really important things that we can do to help make a difference with stuff. And then advocacy means influencing others' politics to adopt a specific course of action or policy to solve a societal problem. So ways that you can build relationships with others to try and help with advocacy, again, letters or visits to lawmakers, contributions of money, contributions of labor, expertise or influence, and then grassroots network development. Advocacy begins with the art of influencing others to adopt that specific course of action to solve a societal problem. Okay. All right, you guys, so that's the rest of that stuff. So we will have our test next week. We'll do it first thing. I think we all were good in this class with math, so you guys should be good to go with that. Did you guys all get my tips for the test? An email, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So just try and go through that and see if you can look through that stuff a little bit more. This, looking through this test, it's very lots of definition type things that you need to know. So I don't know if you're good at, knowing definitions, but maybe you can kind of look at it that way. It's kind of a different type of class compared to some of the others. There are some types of application kind of questions, like it might ask you about like police power or something like that and say, here's an example of that. What can you pick out which one would be police power or something? I don't know. So something along those lines. That's the kind of stuff that you'll see. Real quick before I let you go, I just wanted to say, I don't think everyone's in here at the moment, but so I was talking to your clinical instructor for your other class, our NU 402, the family nursing. She was saying that there's some people that haven't got certain assignments done. So I just want to reiterate to everyone that when you have clinical, your day of clinical, you make sure that you are there on time, because this is considered like your clinical, even though it's online and it doesn't feel like that. You should be there on time. You should be there for the whole amount of time that she's there talking to you and participate. And then when she lets you go, you should go work on your clinical assignments right then and there. And make sure you turn them in when they're supposed to be due. Like, you don't want to have things not turned in. That would be ridiculous to try and, not do all of the things that you're supposed to be doing, because then you're going to end up not passing clinical. So make sure that you're turning things in on time. And then, just do your best to participate. I know this isn't the ultimate clinical situation. I get it, but we'll have to do the best we can for now. So just kind of work with her, because she's very good. She knows what she's talking about with that stuff. And then with this stuff for community, I get it. It's kind of crazy with the clinical for that. I totally get that. We'll just do the best we can with it. Are you guys doing okay with your clinical groups that we're in for those projects?
It's hard to go back to do the projects he gave us when we already did the clinical.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. He wants something due on Friday, but it was the clinical from last week, and we can't get back into it. So we'd have to go back in and redo the entire clinical, which doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay. Was that just this week?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
we had a clinical due last week, and then this week he was like, well, don't do the clinical for this week because now we have to do paperwork for last week's, but you can't.
Well,
Like-
he probably needs to go in and reopen it up so you could get to that stuff.
I don't think you can get back into the stuff that we need to do the clinical. Like it's like part of the actual like scenario kind of thing. Like I don't think going back in would like help at all, unfortunately.
So what I would say then, like him and I were just trying to figure out easier things for you guys to do for clinical because the options that they gave us were just crazy. Like, oh, write a 2 to 3 page paper about such and such. You know, that's the kinds of things they were saying. So I was trying to pick things that would be like, oh, here, this is like a fill in the blank question type thing that is easier to do than like a paper, you know?
Yeah.
So what I would say then, which I can email him about this, but if it's hard for you guys to go back in and do something that you'd already done, then maybe he can just have you write some kind of like 1 to 2 page, whatever, to summarize something that you learned from that week or something. I don't know.
I mean, like if he would have just been like, at the time, this is what you have to
Yeah,
do.
and that's partly my fault because they don't explain any of this crap to us and we're just trying to figure it out ourselves. So I'm looking at our clinical hours and I'm like, how are we going to get our clinical hours? This makes no sense. And then once I looked into it more, I kind of figured it out. But it was kind of, we were already into it at that point. So
Yeah, our clinical for our labor and delivery class is like pretty much spot on. I wish they were all like that. Like it's very laid out. Everything we have to do is laid out for us. We don't have to go back and do anything. So yeah, even if you can just maybe work to do one of those type of things, just so it's the same or something.
well, I did he send that to you guys?
Send what?
Yes.
That
The
like the mapped
schedule.
out everything?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I did that day. I mapped it all out. But that's the thing. I don't go in there and look at that stuff that you guys have to do. So I don't always know, if something doesn't work, then we need to do something else instead, So it's probably just this week and maybe one other week that might be like that for you guys. I think the rest of the time it should be fine. It should be all stuff that you do that day. So I'll touch base with him and see if maybe we can do some kind of alternative assignment to help with that.
That works.
But my concern though is your paper stuff. Are you guys into that okay? Are you figuring that stuff out?
Yeah.
And you guys have picked your town that you're doing and you've all, done your windshield survey and all of that?
I know our group picked our town. I just had one question with that. Is there like stuff due every week or is it just like one bulk thing? Like that's where I kind of got a little lost.
So there is, which I don't know what he gave you. I think I posted some stuff, but basically there's this paper that's like guidelines for when you should try and have things done by, like by what week. And so I'm trying to keep you guys doing like little chunks of the paper at a time. So, okay, now I have this chunk done. So now I move on to this. And because it's so overwhelming, it's so big that if you do it all at one time, it's too much of a pain. You need to do it in little chunks. So like the first part of it, like that windshield survey, there's like a paper that you have to fill out and that should be due. I think I had it due for this coming week. So week 4. So it's like it's called the CAT, the Community Assessment Tool. Here, let me see if I put it on here. I'll show you what I'm talking about.
You put them in announcements.
Yeah. I'll just pull it up real quick to show you what I'm talking about. That's this thing here. So basically, whenever you do your windshield survey, you should have this with you so that you can address each one of these things on here and like write stuff in on the right-hand side. And then you would turn this into me so I can see kind of what you have done so far. Make sure you're on the right track. It has some, directions up here at the top. So I put, please print and turn the completed document to instructor by 5/18, which is already passed because today's the 20th. So if you didn't do this yet, just do it by next week. Just have it done by next week so you're not too far behind on everything. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Thank you.
And like the next thing, and it's not like you're not getting a grade per se on this, but I just want to make sure you're on the right track with what you're doing. So that's why you're turning things into me occasionally, so I can be like, oh yes, this is good, keep going, you know. That's all it is. So don't be like, oh, you know, this has to be perfect or something. It totally does not. And like one of the next things you would have to be working on would be like your history of your town. There's a whole big paragraph that you're supposed to write about your town. So that would be another thing that you'd need to start working on if you haven't started that yet.
So do we all need to turn in, because we're doing the same thing. Do we all need to turn it into you?
No, so I should have like two things, you know, one from one group,
Okay,
one from
just
the
the
other.
one.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So I don't know if you guys have done this, but it might be useful just to pick like a person who's kind of like a leader of your group to, you know, coordinate everything. And then just make sure that you're all doing equal things, because you don't want one person doing more than everyone else, because that gets kind of looked at as well. Okay. And if you have, I mean, obviously, if you have further questions, just, you know, you can talk to me. It's no big deal. I can always do like a Zoom thing like this to show you what I'm talking about if you don't understand something too. It's fine. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll let you guys go. Have a good rest of the day. Let me know if you need anything.
Thank you.